Chapter 23 of A Treasury of Heroes and Heroines. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Timothy Luke. A Treasury of Heroes and Heroines by Clayton Edwards. Chapter 23. Abraham Lincoln. The story of Abraham Lincoln should bring more inspiration to you than that of any other man or woman who is mentioned in this book. For Lincoln not only had a great mind, a great and forceful personality, but a great and kindly heart, filled with charity for all. He was, moreover, a man of the people. Whatever he gained in life, he gained by his own efforts. Washington created the United States, but Lincoln carried them through the most difficult crisis of their history, and it is more than probable that without him there would be no United States today. He was born in 1809 in Hardin County, Kentucky, on the 12th of February, and was the son of Thomas Lincoln, a carpenter. Thomas Lincoln was a good-natured but shiftless man who never did any more work than was absolutely necessary to keep his family from starving. He had pioneer blood in his veins, as indeed all Lincoln's ancestors had, from the time when they first came to America in 1637, and this fact kept them pushing continually to the westward and taking up new lands in unbroken country as opportunity offered. Thomas Lincoln's wife, Nancy, was made of better stuff than her easygoing husband, and it is probably from her that the boy Abraham inherited the character that was to make his name the greatest in his country, if not in the entire world. As a boy, Abraham had little or no chance to go to school, but he was so industrious and eager to learn that he borrowed every book that he could lay his hand on, and in this way he obtained a thorough knowledge of the Bible and of Shakespeare, as well as of a few other classics, which included Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, A History of Washington, and The Pilgrim's Progress. When Abraham was 8 years old, his father moved to Indiana, and there the first great sorrow of his life befell the little boy. His mother died of a fever that appeared among the settlers, leaving Abraham and his sister Sarah, a little girl of 11, to do the housework and the heavy chores of a backwoods farm. The following year Thomas Lincoln went away to Kentucky to marry again, and he brought back with him a big-hearted woman named Sally Johnson, who had 3 children by a former marriage. This marriage by Thomas Lincoln was the best thing that could have happened for his 2 motherless children. Sally Johnson was able to give them better care and more comforts than they had ever known. She inspired their father also to work more regularly and to put a door on the cabin in which they lived. Abraham helped his father in clearing the land and hewing the trees. He was big and strong for his age and was constantly swinging an axe or guiding a plow. All the time when not engaged in these active forms of labor, Abraham was reading and studying, by candlelight or by firelight, chalking up sums of arithmetic on a board or the back of a shovel when he lacked paper to write them on, and striving in every way to gain for himself an education. Owing to the remote region where he lived and the constant moves that were made by his family, he had less than a year's schooling in the entire course of his life. But his eagerness to learn counterbalanced this disadvantage, and when he reached young manhood he knew as much as many who had been to the finest schools in the country from their earliest years and without interruption. When he was 21 years old, his father moved again. This time Thomas Lincoln settled in Illinois, and Abraham worked without pay for a year, helping him to clear his property and settle his land. Then, as was the custom in those days, he left home to seek his fortune elsewhere. By this time he had grown into a tall and powerful man who was able with great ease to outstrip all others in running or jumping, swinging an axe, or carrying heavy weights. His strength, in fact, was as famous throughout the countryside as was his good nature and kindness, for he was always ready to give his neighbors a hand when they needed help, and to do them a good turn when the chance came his way. Everybody liked him, and he was welcome wherever he went. With two relatives, Lincoln built a flatboat and started down the river for New Orleans on a trading venture. He had been south once before, when he traveled more than 1,000 miles on a flatboat, selling groceries to the plantations of Mississippi, and these two trips enabled him to see what slavery was like. He saw negroes being placed on the auction block and knocked down to the highest bidder, separated forever from their wives and families. He saw them toiling in the fields and triced up under the lash. It was then, without doubt, that he formed the opinions that directed his policy from the White House in later years when he was president. On returning to his home, Lincoln had his first taste of military service. A war had broken out with the Black Hawk Indians, and volunteers were called for to drive them out of the country. Lincoln was one of the first to offer his services, and although still very young, every man in the neighborhood urged that he be made the captain of the military company in which they were to serve. It was a sign of the esteem in which the ungainly young man was held that those older than himself should unanimously propose him for their leader. Before this time, Lincoln, young as he was, had announced his candidacy for the legislature of Illinois. The county of Sangamon, where he lived, was entitled to 4 representatives. He had informed the residents that he was a candidate by a characteristic letter which was printed in the county newspapers and has been quoted in Lincoln's biographies. "Every man is said to have his peculiar ambition," he wrote. "Whether it be true or not, I can say for one that I have no other so great as being truly esteemed by my fellow men by rendering myself worthy of their esteem. How far shall I succeed in gratifying this ambition is yet to be developed. I am young and unknown to many of you. I was born and have ever remained in the most humble walks of life. I have no wealthy or popular relations or friends to recommend me. My case is thrown exclusively upon the independent voters of the county, and if elected, they will have conferred a favor upon me for which I shall be unremitting in my labors to compensate. But if the good people in their wisdom see fit to keep me in the background, I have been too familiar with disappointments to be very much chagrined." But when the Indian War broke out, Lincoln sacrificed his chances of being elected, preferring to fight for his country in such fighting as came his way, and the victory was won by his opponents. On his return after a bloodless campaign, he started a grocery store in the town of New Salem, Illinois, but the venture was destined to be an unlucky one. The town dwindled in size, the store finally failed, his partner ran away and then died, leaving Lincoln to shoulder all the burden of the debt. Although he had no money and could earn but little, he paid this debt to the last penny, and with proper interest, but the burden saddened his young manhood and put him in poverty and difficulties from which he did not free himself for a number of years. In the year 1834, Lincoln ran once more for the state legislature, and this time, as no obstacles beyond the ordinary came his way, he was elected. This marked the turning point in his career, for he had now embarked on the course that was to end with his election to the presidency. He was sent back to the legislature in 1836 and again in 1838 and 1840, and his policy was marked by broad views and great liberality. As a matter of fact, he was one of the first champions of woman's suffrage, for in preparing his platform he said that he was for allowing all whites to vote who bore the burdens of the government, including the women. While in the legislature, Lincoln had the courage to voice a protest against slavery, and at that time the feeling ran so strongly against abolitionists, as the would-be liberators of slaves were called, that he could only get one man beside himself to sign this protest. In it he stated that slavery in itself was evil and unjust, but that the efforts of the abolitionists only served to add to its horrors. By this statement, Lincoln ran grave danger of being ruined in his political career, and only his high moral courage impelled him to make it. In 1839, The state capital of Illinois was moved to Springfield, and Lincoln decided to live in the same town. While he had been serving his country in the legislature, he had also been studying law, a pursuit that he commenced when he owned the unlucky general store at New Salem. Now he hung up his shingle as a lawyer, going into partnership with John T. Stuart, who was prominent in Lincoln's own political party, whose members were called Whigs. Before very long he had a good practice. Here Lincoln engaged to fight a duel, showing at once his courage and the keen sense of humor that he possessed. Some women friends of his had sent to the newspapers a series of humorous letters criticizing one James Shields, an Irishman, who was engaged in tax collecting. These letters were signed by the name of Aunt Rebecca, and to help the ladies, Lincoln had written the first letter as a model. When Shields started inquiries, Lincoln took the entire responsibility. Shields belonged to the opposite political party and challenged Lincoln to a duel. As the challenged, Lincoln was allowed to choose the weapons. He decided on broadswords of the largest possible size. A plank was to be placed between the duelists, and neither allowed to cross it. On either side of the plank lines were drawn at the length of the broadsword and 3 feet extra, and if the duelist stepped back across this line, he lost the fight. These terms had a large element of the ridiculous about them. The meeting came to pass, but the duel never was fought, for Lincoln and his adversary were reconciled before the swords were drawn. Soon after this, Lincoln married Mary Todd, a Kentucky girl who had been one of the originators of the letters that brought about this duel. A few years later, in 1846, Lincoln was elected to Congress. In his first term in the House of Representatives, he did nothing to distinguish himself, but kept his eyes and ears open and used the term more as an instructive course in some university of politics than anything else, although he took care not to neglect the work of his constituents. In fact, there is, or was at that time, a general idea that it was impossible to distinguish oneself in a first term to Congress. There was too much to learn, too many duties to perform, too slight an acquaintance with fellow members. Lincoln, however, quickly became known in Washington and was liked wherever he went. He had a gift for storytelling that he frequently made use of, either to amuse his hearers or to take the bitterness out of some political argument. While in Washington as a congressman, he made his first actual effort toward the abolition of slavery by drawing up a bill for the freeing of slaves in the District of Columbia and paying their owners a good price from the coffers of the government. This bill had many supporters, but it was obstructed and never came to a vote. It showed, however, as his earlier and courageous protest showed, the thoughts that were in Lincoln's heart about this great national evil, and that he could be relied on to do all that lay in his power to end it. After Lincoln's term in Congress was over, he returned to Springfield, where, for a number of years, he quietly practiced law without thinking of returning to office. He did desire to be governor of the territory of Oregon, and was offered this position, but gave it up because his wife refused to live so far away. It is just as well that he did so, for who knows if his great powers would ever have been recognized if he had taken this appointment and lived in even more of a wilderness than where his forefathers had cleared the land and made their homes. The war against slavery was gaining headway, and every year the feeling became more intense over the fact that certain states were allowed to hold men in bondage and buy and sell them like animals. Whenever a new territory was acquired by the Union, a dispute arose as to whether it was to be a slave or a free territory, and this discussion was opened up with bitterness in 1854 when Lincoln's great rival, Senator Douglas, offered a bill to bring about territorial government in Nebraska. On account of this struggle, Lincoln came once more into the public eye. Douglas had believed that by working to repeal a measure known as the Missouri Compromise, thereby throwing open to slavery a large amount of territory that had been closed against it, he would stand an excellent chance of being elected President of the United States. The struggle between the slave and the free factions of the country had now taken on national importance of the first order, and caused the readjustment of the political parties. The Democratic party now became the champion of slavery, while the Whig party and those Democrats who desired slaves to be free were merged in the Republican party to which Lincoln belonged. In the state convention in Illinois, where the Republican party was formed, Lincoln made a wonderful speech, of which only the memory remains. The stenographers and reporters who were supposed to take it down became so enthralled by the words of the great leader that they forgot to make note of those words, and Lincoln, who spoke with few notes, could not remember afterward what he had said. How marvelous the speech must have been is to be seen from the fact that even without written reports its fame traveled through the United States, and those that heard it never forgot the majesty and power of Lincoln's oratory. Lincoln was not yet well enough known to be considered as a candidate for the presidency, but he did receive some support from his party as Republican nominee for vice president. In the meantime, and even before this speech had been made, Douglas had realized the strength of his new opponent and sought to silence Lincoln until after the election. Lincoln and Douglas met in joint debate, and the result of the contest made history. Hoping to entrap Lincoln, Douglas asked him a number of questions, thinking that Lincoln might answer in such a way that his reply would be unpopular to the people of the South. In return, Lincoln asked Douglas such a carefully thought out question that in answering it, Douglas was compelled either to deny his former words or make himself unpopular with the Democratic party. And as a result of this, Douglas was greatly weakened for the presidency in the campaign of 1860. Lincoln's brilliant speeches and his former political record, his reputation for honesty and kindness, and his known firmness against the issue of slavery were doing their work, although he himself did not dream that he might gain the presidency that Douglas had aspired to. He continued to make speeches in 1859 and followed Douglas about, speaking against his policy. In May 1860, the Republicans of the state of Illinois declared Lincoln to be their choice for president without a dissenting vote. The Republican National Convention for that year, held in Chicago, was a memorable meeting. The two names that stood out above all others were those of William H. Seward and Abraham Lincoln. Several ballots were taken amid scenes of great excitement, and at last the name of Lincoln was given to the country as the Republican candidate for president. And the campaign itself was the most memorable presidential campaign in the history of this country. In all, there were 4 candidates. The Democratic Party was split into 2 wings, one of which, with Douglas for its choice, claimed that it did not pretend to decide whether slavery was right or wrong. The other, with Breckinridge, was directly in favor of slavery and sought to extend it and to add new states to the slave list. There was also the Constitutionalist Union Party, in which slavery was not an issue at all, or anything else for that matter, while the Republican Party, with Lincoln at its head, was directly opposed to slavery and had come out as its open and declared enemy. On the night of the election, which fell on the 6th of November, Lincoln heard news by electric telegram of his overwhelming victory. His speeches and his strong personality had won the day. He was chosen as president at a time when the most difficult and arduous duties since the time of Washington awaited the head of the nation. Throughout the South, bitterness had been growing more and more marked each day. The South had declared that it would never bear the rule of a Republican president and an opponent of slavery. And after the Southern states knew that Lincoln was to be their leader, one after another withdrew its congressmen and senators from Washington and passed what they called ordinances of secession, which meant that they no longer considered themselves a part of the United States. More than this took place, for one after one, the army officers in charge of the Southern forts and arsenals went over to the side of the South, allowing the most important military strongholds and vast amounts of military stores to fall into their hands, and President Buchanan, who was Lincoln's predecessor and in sympathy with the South himself, did nothing to prevent these outrages against the government he had sworn to uphold. In the meantime, Lincoln had performed his first official act which would have indicated, if other things had not amply done so, his coming greatness. This was his choice of a cabinet. Believing that he must not only surround himself with the strongest men he could find, but the ones that the people placed most reliance in, he appointed to the cabinet all the other Republicans whose names had been mentioned for president at the Republican convention in June. William H. Seward was his Secretary of State, and the other cabinet officials included Salmon P. Chase of Ohio, who was Secretary of the Treasury, Simon Cameron of Pennsylvania, and later Edwin M. Stanton as Secretary of War. The difficulties and dangers of his position now beset him. On his way to his inauguration he was warned that in Baltimore there had been discovered a plot against his life, and so serious did this plot appear that he had to go through secretly on another train than the one on which he was expected. In his inaugural address, assuming the duties of president, Lincoln denied the right of any state to secede from the Union, and this was taken by those states that already had seceded, and in fact by the entire South, as little less than a declaration of war against them. All through the South, preparations for war were carried on as quickly as possible, and in less than 6 weeks after Lincoln had taken over the duties of his office, the Civil War was opened by the Confederates, who turned their guns against Fort Sumter, which was held by the Union commander, Major Anderson. From that time on, the story of Lincoln's life is almost the same as that of the great Civil War, in which as president he decided most of the momentous questions that came before the nation, and bore upon his shoulders a weight even greater than what had been carried by Washington when the United States was born. In the first part of the war the South won many victories. They defeated the Union forces at Bull Run and Fredericksburg, and with smaller forces and these divided were able to fight what amounted to a drawn battle at Antietam. They defeated General Hooker at Chancellorsville, and when it began to look as if the South, under the brilliant General Robert E. Lee, had more than a chance of gaining what they desired and winning independence from the federal government, general after general was placed in command of the Union forces and proved inadequate to the gigantic task that had to be fulfilled. And Lincoln, in addition to his other duties, had to study and master the art of war so that he could intelligently understand the military situations that came to him for final decision. No greater tribute can be made to the power of his brain than to say that after he had followed his military studies, this lawyer and backwoodsman was considered among the best strategists in the country. It was shortly after the Battle of Antietam that President Lincoln decided to issue his famous proclamation giving freedom to all the slaves in the United States. He decided to do this because it was a war measure, and the South had been able to obtain much military aid from the slaves who were in their possession. Also, it won the North to a more wholehearted prosecution of the war, since by far the greater part of the North desired the immediate freedom of the slaves. This proclamation was called the Proclamation of Emancipation, and under it all men in the United States really became free and equal for the first time in American history. At last, Lincoln had realized his lifelong desire to right the wrong of slavery, and throughout the world this act added greatly to his fame. By the black race he was looked upon as a second savior, and whenever he was seen by a group of Negroes they raised the echoes with their shouts of enthusiasm and jubilee. Another great deed was done by Lincoln, and one that was to have an immediate effect upon the course of the war. This was the appointment of General Ulysses S. Grant to the position of Commander-in-Chief of the Union forces. General Grant, like Lincoln, came from obscure beginnings. He had volunteered his services at the beginning of the war and had won his way upward through sheer merit. On the 4th of July, 1863, he had captured the southern city of Vicksburg, while General Meade in the same year beat the Confederates decisively on the field of Gettysburg, which was the greatest battle of the war and marked its turning point. It was after Gettysburg that President Lincoln made the memorable address upon the field of victory that has gone down into history as one of the finest speeches ever made, and has been placed above the portals of one of England's greatest colleges as an example of the purest example of English speech that has ever been uttered. 77 years ago, said Lincoln, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation, so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that the nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The turning point of the war had been reached. The victory of the Northern forces was now assured. On the 9th of April, 1865, General Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, and the war was brought to an end. In the meantime, Lincoln had been reelected president by an overwhelming majority. He now had before him the difficult task of reconstruction and of bringing together the warring factions that so nearly had torn our nation in two halves forever. His kindliness, his personal bravery, which made him regardless of all risks and repeated threats of assassination, his infinite tact, resourcefulness, and good humor, coupled with the weightier abilities as a ruler and a statesman, have made his name most justly the most famous in our history, with the possible exception of George Washington's. There is an infinite fund of anecdotes concerning him and what he did in the dark days through which he piloted the country. Lincoln was always gentle when there was the least excuse for gentleness, and he pardoned so many military offenders who had been under sentence of death that the Union generals complained that he was weakening their discipline. Yet this gentleness on his part was never confounded with weakness. No more terrible contestant could have appeared against the rebellious South than the quiet, gaunt backwoodsman who had placed himself in the president's chair by reason of his character alone. On April 14, 1865, when attending a performance at Ford's Theater in Washington, President Lincoln was murdered. His assassin was John Wilkes Booth, brother of the famous actor Edwin Booth, who was in no way implicated with the terrible deed perpetrated by one that bore his name. Wilkes Booth was a rabid Southerner and believed that since the North had conquered, vengeance was necessary. He did not see, as many of the defeated Southerners saw clearly, that with the war once ended, Lincoln, with his infinite tolerance and patience, was the best friend that the South could possibly have. Booth forced an entrance into the box where the president was seated, and walking up to him shot him in the head with a pistol. He then vaulted over the rail, and with the shout of Sic Semper Tyrannis ran from the stage in spite of the fact that he had broken his leg in his fall from the box, and succeeded in escaping from the theater. The unconscious president was tenderly lifted and carried across the street to a house that was opposite the theater. Here, at 7 o'clock on the following morning, he passed away. That Lincoln was one of the greatest men of all time and belongs to eternity was realized then, but is still more deeply realized now. His wonderful name has become a household word, not only in the United States, but everywhere. And as the mist of the confusing events that surrounded him is clearing away in the light of history, his form is becoming mightier and more venerable every day. End of chapter 23. Recording by Timothy Luke.